So let's move ahead to the final question of delegates and events. How can we make asynchronous method calls using delegates? Now, before we move ahead and we talk about asynchronous method calls, let's try to understand what basically is a asynchronous calling. What exactly does asynchronous calling means? Here's a simple example of how asynchronous calling looks like. Now here's a client, and this client basically makes a method call to a huge task loop. Okay, so this is a simple method which basically has some kind of a huge task loop. Now what we want is that basically once the client actually calls this huge task loop, the control should immediately come back to the client, and the huge task loop will continue further its operation, and the client will continue further its operation. And once the huge task loop has completed himself, he will make a call back to the client saying that he is completed. So in other words, what we want is, we want that the client, whenever it makes a call to such kind of huge task processing, the control should immediately come back to the client. He will continue his further processing. The huge task will continue its further processing, and once the huge task has done, he will intimate back by a callback to the client. Now this we can achieve by using delegates. So what we'll do is that let's consider a simple example. Let's take up a sample source code, and we'll try to understand that how we can implement asynchronous callback in delegates. So here's a simple example. We have created a simple class called as CLH use task, which has a function called as do use task. Now this do use task, what we are doing in this do use task is basically we are halting for 5000 milliseconds by using the thread.sleep command. And once the halt has finished, or once 5000 milliseconds have finished, we are basically returning a simple string saying that when the task was completed and at what time. So the first step what we do is that we declare a delegate called as pointer to huge task. We then create the object of CLS use task class, that is this class, okay, and we point our delegate to this do use task method. Now normally when we call the delegate, we always use the dot invoke method, but over here we are going to use the dot begin invoke method. Now when you call a delegate by using dot begin invoke method, that means you want to call that method asynchronously. Okay, so the time you call dot begin invoke method, the control will further move ahead, so it will actually call this do use task, okay, and the control will come straightforward here, so it will not wait for 5000 milliseconds. It will just, the control will just move ahead here. Okay, now when we call the dot begin invoke, we also need to point that what is the callback mechanism, or at which method, once the do use task has finished, at which method you want the callback to be happening. So we have over here we have created a simple method called as callback method, and in this callback method we are basically expecting the do use task to make a call once he is done. And what we're doing in this callback method is we are again getting the pointer from the results. So basically when this callback method is called, it will basically give back a result to you. From the result we get back our delegate pointer, and we call the dot end invoke method to get back the string value. We have a string value which is coming out from the do use task. So basically by calling the dot end invoke method, we can get back the string value. So what we have done, first step, we have called the delegate in an asynchronous manner by calling dot begin invoke. Once the huge loop has finished himself, he calls back on this callback method, and we then call the dot end invoke method to ensure that we get the return value from the method. So if you run this program, so you can see that the main method has already executed, and the do use task has just completed. So basically the main method, once it called the begin invoke, it called this do use task, and then later the control directly transferred here. So you can see that we can see this message saying that waiting in main method. So you can see that the waiting in main method over here, and the delegate has now finished after 5000 milliseconds. So if I run this, the huge task has completed after the main method. So in other words, once this begin invoke was invoked, the function was invoked, basically the control went straight forward here, and parallelly the do use task was executing its operation, and once it has done, it actually made a callback to this callback method, and that's where we see this value. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. So in this tutorial what we learned is basically we learned how to actually call a method asynchronously by using delegates. So I hope that you have enjoyed the whole question and answer session of delegates and events, and I'm sure that these 4 videos will help you to understand right from basics to the higher end what exactly was delegates and events. Thank you very much.